first of all, I have to give compliment to Tom. He finished at the dot, so not quite sure I'm going to be as good. Where do I have to press?
Right or left?
Right or left? Okay. So my name is Holger. You guys are actually a little bit too quiet for me. And I was actually told I have to stand still so the camera can catch me. I'm not quite sure that's going to work. I'm Holger. I'm with Layer 7, API management company. But I'm actually also dabbling as an API evangelist for, so I'm traveling the globe for doing API workshops, very similar to this, just a little bit more focused. Yeah, so my talk is actually called You Want a Library with That. If you noticed, outside it's printed SDK, here it's library. What's going on? Well, you know, I felt the title there should be a little bit more formal. You know, SDK sounds more important. The only picture I could find was of a library. But it actually points to something. If you remember, I see at least some faces here who are maybe my age or slightly younger, and then a lot who are much younger. There's, you know, if you just roll back 6, 7 years ago, right? An SDK, what was that? You could get it as on a CD, right? It had like documentation in it, it had test scripts in it, it had like build frameworks in it, and code, obviously, and a library or something. You don't have that today anymore, right? Today what you get is a library, and everything else is on the web. You just pull it yourself down. So when I do my talk, I'm actually going to use interchangeably SDK and library, because in today's world, I think they're pretty much the same. Okay? So when we do our workshops, so I'm going to use this intro with 2 or 3 slides from our workshops. When we do this, those workshops, we kind of start out by talking about that building an API is actually simple, but what it's really hard is to make it an effective API. And then we drill down a little bit, what does that mean? And so I wanted to introduce you to the value chain of an API. And a value chain, essentially, it shows, you know, an API doesn't just stand up on its own, right? It's not a thing on its own, right? You do it for something. It's something. It's a means to an end, and usually that means to an end is a business asset. You know, be it a service, be it data, be it a product, and then an API provider builds on top of that an API, and maybe he owns the business asset, or maybe not. He puts some SLA or usage agreement on it, and then he gives it, or he tries to sell it to a developer who then builds the app, which then he puts into the app store, and then an end user buys that app and uses the app, which then uses the API. So that's kind of the what I call the API value chain. And when we talk about effective API design, we're talking exactly about those 2 steps. How can the API provider provide an API which is suitable, which is effective for the developer? Because in the end, if you just kind of drill down here, the API is the product, the developer is the customer. So, and he needs to fill the love. So, quick question: who from here is like business, more on the business side of things? A few hands. Don't be shy. You know, I'm not going to bite. But unfortunately, this talk is going to be a little bit more on the coding side. So, who is here? Who are coders here? Yes, you're my crowd. Okay. So this talk is for you. But still, you know, we love you too. We need you too. So when I'm at that point where I'm talking about effective API design and that you should build for developer experience, not UX but DX, you also see, this is usually when someone asks, well, you know, does it mean I have to ship an SDK? And I have had that more and more showing up in the workshops, which is what inspired me to do this little presentation here on, is maybe nowadays an API kind of already past the hype cycle and people are all excited about SDKs and just use SDKs and don't really care anymore if there's an API or what that API looks like, etc. So obviously Google seems to confirm it, right? You look at it, everyone seems to throw an SDK at you with in any language of your choice, etc. So that was the starting point, right? So is SDK the new API? Should we more talk about SDK design than should we talk about API design? So I did a little self-experiment. Anyone here familiar with a company called Segment.io? Wow, Denmark is much more cutting edge than Sweden is. So for those of you who don't be afraid. It's essentially a broker, an API broker. Usually when you run a web app, you integrating with things like Google Analytics, Kissmetrics, Customer I/O, User Voice, all those different things, you know, help desk. There are different services out there. And after the third integration in your web page, you kind of ask yourself, well, there should be an easier way. And then usually you find Segment.io. You integrate with Segment.io, and then Segment.io gives you a dashboard, and then it feeds all your single integration data into all those other different vendors. I can set up Google Analytics, Customer Voice, yada yada. So it makes it very easy to take one set of data and then spray it across whatever service provider, analytics provider you need for your web app. And using it, you know, this is literally a screenshot of the developer page. You just do cut and paste of this little snippet. You drop it into your HTML body web page. It just works. I find it amazing. It just really works, and so thumbs up. I love it. Okay, so 1-0 for the SDK camp, right? Because that's an SDK right there, a JavaScript SDK, right? Cut and paste. So let me ask you this. You see, this is a question and answer. I need you guys to be a little bit more active. Anyone know what this is? A Fitbit, yes. You know who gave it to me? My wife. Who knows what else showed up new in my apartment? A weight scale. I have no idea how those two things are connected. I mean, you know, look at me. I'm middle-aged, you know. Anyway, so my wife gave me this for Christmas, and I thought, whoa, that's cool. I don't need it, but it counts my steps, and it sends it up to the cloud. And guess what? There's an API for it. So I thought, okay, you know, 1-0 for SDK. Let's keep pushing it. So I did an experiment with Fitbit API. So that's their development page. Actually, that's just how it looks like. Welcome, it's an API. I log in, I get an account, and that starts to look slightly different than what I just had with Segment.io. A lot of text, OAuth authentication, resource access, so it seems to be a step up in terms of complexity. And I hadn't formulated it in my head, but I was missing things. You see, I see a Java library, a Java reference client, a PHP.NET. I didn't see JavaScript. And so one of the first realizations I had was that implicit in me wanting to use this API, I wanted to have JavaScript. I wanted to do a single page client app, but all I got was PHP. I hope there's no PHP. I'm not going to hurt any feelings here. And by the way, I'm using those companies as an example, right? I love my Fitbit. My wife at least tells me I should. And so I'm not trying to knock down on them negatively, but I just want to kind of make it as an example, show you some of the pitfalls which can happen. So anyhow, so I wanted JavaScript, I got PHP. Second thing, I wanted client-side. All I got was server-side. So, you know, and just, I kind of took note of it. It didn't quite make sense yet to me, but so then, you know, I have a MacBook. I don't know who has installed PHP lately on their MacBook. I hadn't. It was actually quite a experience. So I haven't used PHP before, but I figured, you know, a lot of people use it, so it can't be too hard. So I went ahead and set it up, and set it up, and set it up, and Googled, and went to Stack Overflow. It wasn't quite as easy as I thought, and at this point, I had spent 2/3 of my day on it, but theoretically, I was able to run it. But guess what? I was server-side, so I still had to enable the Apache server, had to enable the PHP in the Apache server, yada yada. Day was over. I was finally ready to play with that piece of PHP. So, as you can imagine, my mood, you know, maybe was the amount of coffee I consumed in the process, but you know, I wasn't quite, well, here I have beer. I shouldn't have done that. But anyhow, And again, another observation, right? They gave me fine code, except it wasn't the code I wanted. It wasn't on the side of the communication I wanted. And I had to install a bunch of frameworks, which I didn't care for and never did. And I ended up spending a day trying to get it to run. And boy, that code. Now, I don't know about you, but all it really does is it calls in, gets as a fixed state, and gets some data back and renders it in an HTML page. And I just simply cut it off here. I didn't want to make it even smaller. So that code certainly looks complex. Okay. Now, I happen to also be business developer of Layer 7 for everything called IoT, Internet of Things. You might have heard about it. It's the big hype word now. One of those parts of IoT I'm tracking is companies who are now selling you SDKs with pre-built integrations. Another point, another data point that SDKs seem to kind of suddenly revive and become interesting again. So Temboo, as an example, I don't want to pick on those guys, is publishing or is selling you an SDK or giving you an SDK which has 100 pre-integrated APIs in it. So okay, I go for that, and I have to. I gave you away my punchline here. I was done within 1.5 hours. Of course, granted, I had already PHP installed, so I went through that pain again. But I was done. But then, I looked at that SDK and the code, and here's what I found. So first of all, the code looks reasonably small, right? As PHP code goes, but what I noticed was the way the data coming back was represented kind of looked sticky to me. So I kind of thought, okay, if I build a product, not just integrating with 1, but 2 or 3 other APIs using that SDK, I'm probably never going to be able to switch away from that SDK again, because their data presentation kind of leaked into my API code. There was no abstraction, right? So meaning once I build a product with that SDK, it's probably going to always be using that SDK, or I have to completely rewrite my product. But then really the kicker was I opened up their library, which I had installed, and it had all 150 different API integrations in it. So for using one integration, I essentially carried the weight of 150. So I don't know, that doesn't sound right for me. So to me. So okay, back to square one. So I had assumed that it would be easier doing integrations with SDKs. So now I was at the point, I had tried twice, and both times it kind of something felt like not quite right. So I went back to the original code, the original PHP code, and there were 2 things I noticed. One was that the vast majority of that code dealt with OAuth. They essentially built an OAuth flow in that PHP client. And the second one is all the frameworks I installed was trying to teach XML parsing to those things. So those 2 things. And I thought, okay, if I can kind of find something which takes care of OAuth and then switch to JSON, maybe this is not that bad after all. So welcome to a company called WebShell. They have a service called OAuth.io. Anyone familiar with them? It's essentially what Segment.io is for analytics. OAuth.io is for OAuth. They have tons of OAuth integrations, and they offer you OAuth as a service. So what you do is you do one integration with them, and then they do all the OAuth integration to all the providers you want. So setting it up was super easy. I was done like within minutes. So days, hours, now we are down to minutes. And this is what came out of it. Essentially, that's just the HTML page. Don't judge me by my HTML. But suddenly I was back to where I wanted to be. I had a client page, a single page app, so just client-side code in JavaScript, doing a very simple. So I'm pulling in their OAuth JavaScript library, but then doing 3, 4, 5 lines. Actually, up from here on. Just up there, this is all the code I need to do the integration. And because I'm now in JSON land, I can very easily use that in JavaScript. So that was kind of the client code I was hoping for to start with. So now you're going to wonder, so what is he going to tell us? You know, that those are all cool programs, you should use them. No, this is my punchline. Using an SDK is easier until it isn't. So an SDK, as usual, you know, it's not the solution for everything, but it's still, you know, for something like OAuth or segment IO, some small, narrow-defined use case, they actually seem to work quite well. Okay, so let's come to the big picture. So what am I trying to tell you here? There are certain benefits to SDKs. If it's the right SDK and the right use case, they really reduce your what I call time to first use. So if you can get an SDK out there which essentially enables the developer to get up and running on your API, within minutes, you're gold, right? That developer will have a positive experience. He will have quickly achieved something, and he will want to use your API more than if you send him on a couple of days worth trip of installing frameworks. Second, best client for your API. Remember that a lot of the common API clients you write, right? You're sitting just on a generic HTTP stack on the client side. They are not optimized for APIs, right? They are optimized for a lot of things, but not for APIs. So if your API has certain constraints attached to it, or if the client target has certain constraints, if it's an Arduino or a mobile device, etc., you can use an SDK to kind of slide in the best client for your API, right? Something which is optimized, something which drives your API the right way and prevents the developer kind of from draining the battery or getting CPU bound, etc. This was an interesting case. I didn't come up with that one. There's a blog, not a blog, a podcast out there called Traffic and Weather. I don't know, anyone? It's curated by one of the founders of RunScope. So you guys should look that up. There was one from some guy from Dropbox there. He said, well, what we used an SDK for is we actually took business logic, conflict resolution, which is a big thing for Dropbox. We used that and didn't have that in the API, but moved it out onto the client. This enables us to scale much better and keep the API simple, right? So if you have logic like this, right, conflict resolution, if you had it all on the server side, right, and via the API, that could be very complicated. And you have to scale on the back end. If you pull it to the client and do it there locally, it's probably much more scalable, much more efficient, and your API stays more clean. So that could be a reason to push it to do an API. And then, you know, obviously, if you have people like C++ or Java or C# or Objective-C, some of those developers in those ecosystems really like their presentation in strongly typed languages, right? If you go to .NET and you tell them, well, why don't you use my web API? He will say, well, where's your library to use that, right? I want to have this as in my Visual Studio imported, tie it in, yada, yada. So there's an expectation in certain developer communities, in particular around strongly typed languages, that you give them a library, not a web API. You're laughing? You're disagreeing, or you're? We have similar observations. Okay, good. By the way, you guys can challenge me, right? This is not just a one-way street. So I would love to you know, you say, well, this is crap, but you can, it's all different. Oh, he's really taking that up, huh? That was just a rhetorical. No, but bring it on. What?
No, I was just thinking that you can use it strongly if you just design your web API correctly.
JSON in JavaScript? Yes, but that's. I mean, you have purists who will claim that that's not strongly typed. But yes, JSON and JavaScript obviously go well together. But try to do XML or JSON in a C# or in a Objective-C kind of framework, and people will say, well, that doesn't look like it's that easy, right? So they want to have function calls with the objects kind of being defined, or in Java land. Drawbacks. Let me come to the first one, even though I think that's actually the most important one last. I think what I tried to show you with those examples of those poor Fitbit and Temboo, actually Fitbit, is by publishing an SDK, you have to pick a platform or platforms and frameworks as your personal winners. Now that's okay, for as long as you realize that's a very subjective choice you're making, right? Someone in Fitbit thought that surely you would like to have PHP and surely you wouldn't mind that framework, whereas maybe I don't like PHP, or maybe I do, but maybe I like a different framework. But with an SDK, you can't cover everything. And mostly an SDK is relying on some kind of frameworks underneath to do XML parsing or JSON conversion or do HTTP interactions, etc. So you have to make that choice of a platform and a framework winner, and ultimately you will probably piss a few people off who would not make that choice. So that doesn't mean it's not a choice you can make, but just keep that in mind that you work from your own assumptions, from your own ecosystem, from your own mindset, which may or may not be the mindset of the developers you're targeting with your API SDK. Then the next two should be fairly obvious, right? There's a third-party framework dependencies. Most SDK clients have at least one or two external frameworks which they don't bundle up, but they kind of require. Now, there's a survey actually that a lot of web apps integrate with exactly one API. But once you go to 2 APIs, actually it goes very quickly to up to 10 APIs. So there are very few apps out there. So most of them just have one, which is fine. But the moment you get to 2 or 3, imagine all the different frameworks you're going to pull in. And maybe now one is using the framework at the level of 1.2, the next one uses the framework at level 2.5. So you're just ending up in dependency hell, and maybe or maybe not, some of those actually won't work together. So what are you going to do then, right? Next point, version dependencies between SDK and API. If you rev up the API, if you are owning the SDK, chances are, hopefully, you're going to rev up your SDK too. But if it's, for instance, a community-provided SDK, there might be a time lag between the API going up and the SDK going up, like the Twitter one or something like this. So be aware of that, right? That's probably more on the API consumer side, that maybe the SDK actually won't be following locksteps with the API version. It's another dependency, right? If you're building a product using someone else's API, that's going to come back and bite you, potentially. I talked about the SDK carry-on weight, right? You want 1 or 2 integrations, but you end up with 150 in your library folder. Long-term support costs, that's here. That was my little thing for you financial guys, right? If your developer says, I want to have an SDK, you say, well, how are you going to pay for it? But let me come back to the first one. If you do an SDK first approach, meaning you put your mind around that you're going to publish an SDK, what you might be skipping is designing the web API. I think one of the reasons why we're all here today is because of the popularity of web APIs. We didn't meet here back in the SOA days when it was about web services and XML, right? You probably would have, you wouldn't have come, believe me. So there is something there, something about this REST model, this pragmatic REST model, is very appealing, very kind of opening up, makes it very easy to integrate. Be aware that if you and usually that means that means work on the API provider side, because now you have to take all your functions, all your assets, all your things, and model them in a kind of a resource way. So you have to spend some thought on how you're going to present whatever you're going to do in the API through a resource-based model. When you do an SDK-first approach, that thought you might just skip, right? And you go straight into some kind of RPC style, back to the SOA days where everything was a function and you just call and yada yada. And everyone here familiar with Evernote as an app? Have you ever looked at their API? It's SDKs. Do you know why? Okay, that's a true answer. No, you're correct. But what they're doing is they're using a framework called Thrift. It originated in Apache. It's a competitor to Google Protobuf. It's now a Facebook, and now they gave it to Apache. It's a binary protocol. But they actually have a listing of their functions in their API. And boy, it looks like a programming language, right? It's just function with lots of parameters. There is no RESTful model on Evernote, right? And when I saw that, I kind of figured, you know, when you skip that step, we might actually lose the very thing which made web APIs so popular and so successful, which is the simplicity, the abstraction away from function calls. Okay, using SDKs in production. This is actually not my list. I put you a little link down here. Read that article. It's really good. Essentially, when you use SDKs in production, just be aware of it. It doesn't mean you don't have to do it, but just be aware of it, right? How are they instrumented? When there's something happening in that SDK, are you actually going to find the bug, right? Or you're just looking at it and saying, well, something failed. I don't know what it is. Metrics. Is the SDK actually giving you back metrics which you need in order to provide your service? Error handling and idempotency. What if a post fails? Is he just going to redo the post and redo the post and redo the post? You know, if it's a credit card transaction, that might not be a good idea. But those are the things which actually then end up on your plate because your product is the one the developer uses and not the backend API you're using it. And you know, does he do the right thing for the right error code? You don't know. So you have to start actually looking into the SDK, which kind of removes the very point on why you used an SDK in the first place to get there fast. Performance and persistent connections. That's extremely important on the mobile case, right? Is that SDK just keep opening up new connections, or are they using a single connection? You know, what's the battery life? What's the drainage rate? How do you find your way around in the SDK? Is there documentation, or you just go back to grabbing through the source code? And then ultimately, you know, how do you upgrade the SDK? You just patch it, you do a forklift upgrade, and then you get all the framework dependencies up, and then those other guys who are also relying on that framework have to upgrade. You know, it's kind of like this ripple chain. So those are the things you need to be thinking about when you put an SDK into production. When to consider SDKs? We talked already about most of this. Time to first use. That's actually, in my mind, the key for publishing an SDK. Time to first use. Just get the developer quickly onto your API. Best client for your API. We talked about it. Private and partner APIs. Small groups of known users versus large group of unknown users. Public APIs. So private and partner APIs. It maybe goes with this one, right? Maybe you want to give your partner the best client for your API because you know him, you know his expectations, and he will be grateful for it, right? So these two things might go together. And then developer expectations we talked about, right? In .NET, web APIs are usually not consumed as a web API, but as a library. Coming to the closure of my talk, this is my advice. Publish an SDK with the purpose of getting the developer quickly on board with your API, but then do everything possible to transition him to using the web API in production. Thank you. Questions?